Good morning, everybody. We'll give it a minute to allow people to enter the Zoom, and then we'll get started. Good morning again, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well on this lovely Tuesday, at least here in California. I'm excited to introduce today's discussion. My name is Jeff Hancock. I'm a professor of communication here at Stanford, and we'll introduce the second issue of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety. I'm excited to do that along with my collaborators, Alex Stamos, Shelby Grossman, and Dan Bateko. As many of you know, since you're here, this is an exciting new journal with the aim of providing a home to research that just isn't available anywhere else in the world. Not only are we trying to use a super interdisciplinary approach to issues of safety and trust online by having scientists from all spectrums contribute here, both from computer science and security spaces, but also the social sciences, sociology, psych, comm, among others. We're also opening up the journal to non-academics. So we're really eagerly looking to have people from industry that are working on this project, policy, law enforcement, everybody that has an interest in this area, and frankly, who doesn't. Along with that, we're trying some new journalistic practices. So we're trying to have really flexible formats so that people from different spaces who write articles and do reports in different ways can be considered here. So it's not just intro, methods, results, and discussion like I usually do, which has been really exciting. And we are using a letter of interest approach so that people can find out really quickly whether their work is a good fit and not have to wait the 3 to 10 months of the usual academic journal to find out whether their project is likely to be accepted here or not. The submission deadline for our next journal issue of the journal is March 31st. So letters of inquiry are welcome by then. Letter of inquiry can be anywhere from a page to 2, whatever you think is sufficient to explain to us and describe the project. And then we provide feedback. Either it's a good fit and we'll give you some more guidance, or we'll suggest other places that it might be a better fit if it doesn't work well for us. And we try to get that back to you really fast. Shelby and Dan in particular are super on top of things. So it's really nice to work with such a crack team. We do have an upcoming special issue and a symposium on cryptocurrency and societal harm that I'm particularly excited about, especially given with all the changes over the last several years, but perhaps the move of Russia to full crypto if the ruble keeps going down. Should be really interesting then. You submit a full paper by June 15th. Letters of inquiry are welcome before then. The symposium will be on May 13th, and you can apply to participate for that by the end of March 28th. And we encourage submissions from the broad array that I mentioned already: academia, researchers at platforms, folks from civil society, policymakers, law enforcement, the whole gamut. So we're really excited for that, and please spread the word. And with that, I'll turn it over to my collaborator and friend, Alex Stamos, who will introduce today's special issue.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So one of the things that we're hoping you notice today is that a couple of the themes of the reasons why we created this journal are really well represented. One is, like Jeff said, our goal was to have cross-disciplinary work. But we also had the goal to have people who are working on trust and safety issues on a professional basis, working with academics and other researchers. And we have great examples of all of this kind of unique work happening throughout the journal today. You're going to be hearing about a survey paper by political scientists that is involving deepfakes. There's a paper that you'll hear about today about an NGO working with a criminologist to survey people who are searching for child sexual abuse materials and learning about the reasons that have driven them to do so. There's work by academics working with Discord to understand a novel moderation effort and to see whether that moderation effort was effective. And we have more work from legal scholars, computer scientists, and political scientists and psychologists. So I'm really proud that with the second edition, I feel like the journal is coming into its own of one, going after these really critical topics that are sometimes, I think, understudied in the academic world, and two, creating collaborations that wouldn't normally have a space. So now Dan's going to talk about what we're going to do today.
Thanks, Alex. So just a quick run of the show. There's not going to be a Q&A at the end, but please put any questions you might have for the authors in the chat, and they will do the best they can during the webinar to answer them. I want to give a big thanks to Shelby Grossman, who put this all together, without whom this journal wouldn't be possible, and to our editorial board members. Those include David Teal, Elena Christ, Alex Stamos, Jeff Hancock, our editorial board and reviewers, and of course our amazing copy editors, Eden Beck and Kelly Friel. Just a note at the top, some of these papers are covering anti-LGBT harassment, child sexual abuse, and harms to children, the latter two of which will be approximately at 9:49 and 10:21 a.m. Pacific time. So listeners, if those are bothersome topics for you, if those are distressing, you're welcome to leave the Zoom at any time. And the last thing I'll note is that the articles are all up on the website at tsjournal.org. So I encourage everyone to go check them out during the webinar, after the webinar. And so with that, let's get started. I'm going to alternate with Jeff and Shelby in interviewing our authors. And over the next hour, you're going to hear from 7 of them. So to start off, hi, John. We are going to start off with John Tarnowski, a postdoctoral fellow at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, who, along with co-authors Joshua Calla and PM Aronow, published The Negative Consequences of Informing Voters About Deepfakes, Evidence from 2 Survey Experiments. So, John, there's more than a few interesting findings here. The paper explores whether warning American voters about the existence of deepfakes makes them more likely to disbelieve real political videos. So could you talk a little bit about how you went about studying the effect of informing voters about deepfakes and what you found?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a pleasure to be here on this webinar and to have my research in this great journal. So basically, we recruited people on an online survey platform to participate in 2 randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And these 2 RCTs were designed to measure the causal impact of being exposed to information warning about the existence of deepfakes, the commonly used term for AI manipulated videos. Specifically, we were interested in seeing whether warning about deepfakes can actually affect whether or not people believe the video of a political speech is real, and whether getting a deepfake warning can actually affect what information is internalized. In other words, if, for instance, there's a video of a politician making a policy statement, do deepfake warnings affect what a voter believes that politician stands for in respect to that policy? And we believe this is a really important point because it goes beyond the deepfake itself. Now, a deepfake could deceive, but what we are talking about is a second-order deception, where a deepfake doesn't even have to exist for deception to take place. So we evaluated the effect of adding a simple warning about the existence of deepfakes above political videos in an online survey. And the good news is that deepfake warnings, when located by a deepfake video, do successfully nudge people to disbelieve the deepfake. So adding a warning to a deepfake does seem to help. The bad news is the same kind of information located by a real video moves people to disbelieve real videos of politicians making policy statement. And this isn't saying that, oh, this video that you're watching is fake. It's just saying deepfakes exist. You have to keep an eye out for them. Having that type of information by a real video makes people disbelieve the real videos. So our first RCT used a video of a fictional politician, but with our second RCT, we replicated our findings using a video of a real politician. Specifically, we found a video of a policy stance that seems surprising and few American voters are probably aware of. So Republican Mitt Romney, at one point when he ran for governor of Massachusetts, said that he planned to back a pro-choice policy on abortion, which is very atypical for a Republican to have, especially in recent times. Well, we found that presenting information warning about deepfakes made people more likely to disbelieve this real video of a real politician making a real policy statement. But most remarkably, the information about deepfakes affected what policy stance they thought Romney had on abortion. And we didn't even ask participants to think about policy stances. audiences, we just ask them to name 3 facts about Romney, anything that comes to mind. And even with such a noisy outcome, we saw significant increases in people believing that Romney had the opposite stance expressed in the video when they were warned about deepfakes. Now, these are results from an RCT online and in a somewhat artificial environment, so we definitely need to replicate these findings more broadly before we panic. We don't know how quickly these effects fade. We don't know whether a news story or a statement about deepfakes by a politician will have the same effects. But there is clearly some basis for concern. If these findings replicate, we may be in a world where news articles about the dangers of deepfakes may nudge people to disbelieve real video footage, and a politician may be able to at least partially disavow past policy stances by simply stating that deepfakes exist.
So we don't have to panic immediately, but it does sound like we want to start thinking about the kinds of warnings that we're giving to individuals online. So if certain kinds of warnings to the public about deepfakes inadvertently heighten the risk that the public will grow to distrust the news or distrust news videos, what are some other ways of informing voters about the risks of deepfakes?
Yeah, that is the big challenge here. Now, unfortunately, the empirical research on this is still fairly nascent, and I'd be hard-pressed to recommend a messaging strategy that is clearly optimal. That said, there have been important advances in the study of how to counter textual misinformation, and it could be fruitful to try similar strategies when communicating about deepfakes. For instance, one could prime people to think critically or consider the sources of political videos. There have also been some promising research on training people to detect deepfakes. And there's been a recent publication looking at automated deepfake detection software paired with human judgment. But I think one of the main points of my and my colleagues' research is emphasizing that even the most well-intentioned information could potentially have these second-order effects. For example, some years back, Jordan Peele had this public service announcement about deepfakes, and he partnered with a team that made a deepfake of him, Jordan Peele, as Barack Obama. And this was to illustrate and warn Americans about this new deepfake technology. And it was viewed by over 5 million people and received a decent amount of media coverage, but the PSA didn't really provide any guidance as to what to do about deepfakes and how to spot them. So the hope of our research is to show that it is important to think about how deepfake information is being communicated to the public. And that's saying something like, in the near future, we won't be able to believe our eyes, can have these unintended backlashes. And there haven't really been too many political deepfakes since the PSA years ago, but there have been years of media coverage of the imminent danger of political deepfakes. And there has already been a prominent legal case where law enforcement appeared to have falsely accused a Pennsylvania woman of making a deepfake when the video in question appears to be real as judged by deepfake experts. So perhaps as an immediate step, any discussion of the possibility of being fooled by deepfakes should be counterbalanced with a possibility of the false positive, mistaking a real video for a deepfake.
Thanks so much, John. I'm going to turn it over to Shelby next to interview our next author.
Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. So now we're turning to Joseph Searing, who is a postdoctoral scholar in the computer science department at Stanford. So Joseph, I love your article. You, in this article, which is co-authored with Brianna Dim, Jeff Kaufman, and Michael Bernstein, you interview 11 moderators who participated in this really unusual moderation effort by Discord. So during Pride Month, when LGBTQ servers on Discord deal with an influx of hate, Discord recruited extra volunteer moderators to support these servers. So could you tell us a little more about this special Pride Mod initiative?
Sure. Right. Thanks, Shelby. So a bit of context here. In the public, discussion about content moderation, models that rely in part on volunteers are often seen as kind of niche or as special cases, but they've quietly actually become more common than models that don't rely on volunteers. So if you look at the largest social media companies, more than half now rely on volunteers to actively moderate content, not just report it or flag it for company review. So that includes Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, Discord, Twitch, and now, of course, most recently, Twitter. So the goal of this paper was really to look at a specific case where that model took an unusual form and to see how well it worked and also what we could learn about the ethics of the approach. So for some background, Pride Month every year is, of course, a time of celebration for LGBTQ plus communities on social media. But the The increased visibility often brings an increase in hate and harassment as well. The Pride Mod initiative, which happened in June of this past year, was part of Discord's approach to preparing for this. And it was unusual in the way that it involved direct collaboration between platform employees and volunteers. So it worked in 3 main steps, and I'm just quickly summarizing. But first, Discord Trust and Safety staff recruited volunteers from, they've really cultivated communities of expert volunteer moderators. So they recruited volunteers from those communities. Second, they sent out a call to servers, Discord servers, to ask whether any LGBTQ plus focused communities felt like they might need extra support during the month. And third, for each community that did request support, volunteers were deployed to that community to bolster their existing volunteer moderation team for the month of June. So basically, and there was more collaboration and back and forth going on throughout this whole process than that, but that's just the brief overview. Basically, Discord employees worked with expert volunteers to help LGBTQ plus communities handle an influx of hate and harassment. So there's a few questions here that we talk about a lot in the paper. First, of course, is, did it work? Yes, to the best we could measure using these methods, it worked very well. All of the volunteers and all of the existing server moderation teams, virtually all were very, very happy with how this worked out. The volunteers were able to jump into the affected communities and learn to contribute quite quickly. Second, the question is often asked, does this scale? People ask whether these sort of personal volunteer-driven efforts scale, but in this case, the answer is very much yes. It took a fairly small amount of time from a few Discord employees and a lot of work from about 60 volunteers to support communities with a total of about 1.1 million members. So, and more specifically, a community with very specific needs in moderation. One of the problems with one of the challenges for the universal top-down approach to moderation is that it's very difficult for companies to really deeply understand the needs of every population on the platform. But this approach really has some potential for handling that in certain contexts. The last question that people sometimes ask about cases like this is whether this is ethical. And there are a lot of reasonable questions to be asked about the ethics of platforms working with volunteers. But it's interesting to note, and of course, we talk a lot more about this in the paper, but all of the users who participated were, I'd say, fairly firmly of the opinion that not only was this an unethical approach, it was actually really a good thing and maybe better than many alternatives. So I guess that's a brief overview.
Super interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, in your paper, you also interviewed the moderators who were involved in this effort. Could you talk a little bit about what worked and what didn't? And if you think this approach is something that other platforms should consider implementing?
Yeah, I think the question of whether other platforms should consider this depends a lot on their context and their needs, and also their existing relationships with volunteers. So Discord has worked for a number of years now to build connections with volunteers. And anybody who's watching can check out discord.com/moderation, which is one example of a resource co-created with expert moderators, volunteer moderators. So there is this existing set of lines of communication and also a network of contacts and mutual understanding. So platforms that have this sort of relationship, which aren't very many, probably are well situated to try something like this in certain contexts. But without that kind of connected network, it's difficult to get something like this started. So one of the main goals of the paper was to talk about how this lengthy upfront work of creating these connections paid off in this situation in allowing this challenge to be handled better than it probably otherwise would have been.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joseph. Jeff, passing it to you.
Thank you, Shelby and Joseph. Congrats on great paper, great work. In this next discussion, just a quick reminder that we'll be discussing content related to child sexual materials, just as a heads up on that. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Nina Vaaranen-Valkonen, who is Executive Director of Protect Children, a nonprofit based in Helsinki that conducts research on pressing child safety issues. Nina, along with her team, administered a survey hosted on dark web search engines, which collected responses from over 1,500 anonymous individuals searching for child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. And as many of you know, studying behavior on the dark web using Tor Onion services is particularly challenging for a whole host of reasons, including both the kinds of content, the kinds of the people in that population, but also methodological issues. So congratulations and a lot of appreciation for your hard work on this, Nina. Could you please talk to us about your research, what research questions drove your inquiry and how you went about surveying CSAM users, which is a difficult population to work with?
Thank you so much, Jeff. For us, Protect Children, all our work focuses to end all forms of sexual violence against children, especially online sexual abuse and exploitation. So for years, we have witnessed the huge increase of distribution and use of child sexual abuse material and all forms of sexual crimes against children. And even there have been a strong attempts to prevent these crimes. Unfortunately, nothing has managed to turn the tide. So if we look, for example, the statistics, like AI tool Project Arachnid led by the Canadians, that gives us an example of the scale of the problem, which is huge. And technology has made possible that one person might have thousands, even millions images on one digital device. So we wanted to do something to prevent sexual crimes in the first place, before any child becomes a victim of sexual violence. And we developed a redirection funded project and funded by End Violence. And our aim was to gather so much information from the CSAM users to develop an evidence-based cognitive behavioral self-help program for them, to help them to change their behavior and stop their use if possible. So we wanted to ask users about their thoughts, their feelings, their behavior in order to make efficient program. And of course, we wanted to get as much information as possible. And as social psychologist and psychotherapist, I knew that to succeed, we needed to approach the users with compassionate way to say, we really need your help. So we named our survey, Help Us to Help You, and approach was successful. And this article includes a sample of 1,546. And we developed the survey in global collaboration with experts. And of course, we asked, do you have any specific questions for people who are using CSAM from the expert? And as you can see, the survey is super long. It has 32 questions. It was a great intervention because the problem, we placed it on the dark web where the problem really exists. So super thanks Dr. Juha Nurmi, as he was the first in making this Child Protection Act and added our surveys to AHMIA. So when individuals search for CSAM with codes, they are redirected, not forced, to the landing page where they are asked compassionate question, help us to help you. And of course, we wanted to measure criminal behavior. So they were also able to click no need for help, which is not in this research article. And after that, it was like tied. So in few days, we understood that we will get a lot of data. So for this first research article from our data, our aim was totally clear. We wanted to get valid new information for crime prevention and have a strong academic research results that underlines the needs for stronger actions to protect children online. And we really need fast actions to fight against online child sexual abuse.
I just think that approach is so amazing. And I still am shocked. I remember when I first seen it, just shocked at how many of those individuals responded and also responded indicating they needed help. So I also love how you're moving the problem away from just like, hey, this is technology and the platforms have to deal with it, to let's help the people that are suffering from this and doing that kind of intervention, which we're seeing more even in John's space on deepfake, like how do we help people become better at misinformation rather than just relying on tech? So kudos. Can you tell us a little bit about the overall findings from your survey? Any of the most important findings that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so the research results are not like news to professionals working in the field. As my dear friend from Europol said to me, I knew it, and I'm so happy that now you have the academic paper to prove it. Findings show that individuals who use child sexual abuse material are not only viewing and using, they are also contacting, grooming children after the use. And this is really, really important information. Almost half of the respondents say they contact children after the use, and 60% of users said that they are afraid that this might lead them to sexual acts against children. So we found also risk factors for those people, like 3. Those who use CSAM more frequently, those who watch CSAM depicting young children, unfortunately toddlers and infants, and 3, those who are in contact with other CSAM users. These were the risk factors for persons to contact, groom children after their use of CSAM. And on the basis of our findings, we call proactive removal of child sexual abuse material with effective tools like the Canadians Project Arachnid. We need stronger digital safety skills education and like our online road safety program, but we need really preventive to prevent these crimes in the first place. This calls for more effective offender-focused prevention. We have a huge data, 17 languages, over 15,000, and we will continue to read and analyze this huge data. And I would like to say my deepest thanks to our research partners, Professor Mikko Aaltonen and Dr. Juha Nurmi, and all our specialists working in Protect Children. Huge respect, first author, specialist Tegan Insol, and international criminal lawyer Anna Ovaska. Your hard work has really made the difference. Knowledge is the key for efficient crime prevention. And sorry, my emotional reaction, but this has been such a great paper. Thank you.
I feel it as well, Nina, and we're so proud and pleased that you've decided to choose JOTS as the home for it. So thank you once again for that really important work. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And Nina, thank you again. Congratulations on a truly phenomenal paper. Autumn, hi. Hi, good to see you. Next, we have Autumn Slaughter, a PhD student in clinical psychology at the University of Tulsa. Autumn, in your article for this issue, New Frontiers, Moving Beyond Cyberbullying to Define Online Harassment, the paper you co-authored with Alana Newman, who I see is in the webinar today. In this paper, you introduced the Online Harassment Experience Questionnaire as an improved way of measuring online harassment. So let's kick us off. Why do we need to measure online harassment, and what are some of the difficulties that come up when we try to measure it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. So we know that online harassment is becoming more and more pervasive. We know that it's doing all kinds of harm. In extreme cases, people are really rightfully afraid for their lives and even their safety. However, in order for us to really understand online harassment and understand the best ways to really target preventative efforts and understand the harm that it's causing, we need to know how to define it and have a way of measuring it across studies. But right now, that tool just doesn't exist. And that's for a lot of different reasons. So there are a lot of just basic methods, factors that go into measuring online harassment. Is it better to ask just a single question? Do we use a behavioral checklist? How do you decide what to put on there? There's also questions of time frames, like lifetime versus 12 months versus 6 months. But one of the real difficulties is that online harassment is so complex and just means so many different things. So there are all kinds of different types, from something like name calling to really credible death threats. There are all kinds of ways it occurs. It can be networked with multiple people targeting one individual. It can be one individual pretending to be a lot of different individuals. The perpetrators can be known to the victim or unknown. It can be very public, like on a public Twitter feed, or it can be private, like through email. And so just sorting through all of that and figuring out the best way to really streamline a single measure of online harassment is really, really difficult. So what we decided to do after looking at the literature is focus on two variables that seem right now to be the most important. And that's just the type of online harassment and then how often it's occurring and how often victims have to experience that.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily tricky and complex issue. So can you explain what the questionnaire you've developed does and what it aims to accomplish?
Yeah, so we developed a questionnaire that examines 8 main types of online harassment. We tried to prevent overlap, so these types are relatively freestanding. We don't have things that would both be like an insult and sexual harassment being double counted. And we asked respondents if they've experienced each type within the past 12 months, and then how frequently. So have you experienced it once this year, or are you experiencing it multiple times a day? And then to just kind of help with research, we classify those 8 types into 2 subcategories. Those types that psychologists would define as potentially traumatic, so online harassment that could expose someone to the threat of serious injury, death, or sexual violence. And then those types that aren't going to reach that kind of definitional of trauma. And the goal was just to create a really simple tool that contains the most discussed types of online harassment in the literature, has that frequency component, and then can be modified so you can add in questions about platform really easily. You can add in questions about networked versus individual online harassment really easily, and hopefully start to apply this in a broader range of contexts so we can understand prevalence better across different groups, we can understand harm better across different groups, and start to have a more cohesive literature of online harassment instead of what we have now, which is really great, but also very scattered and not really talking to each other very well.
Thanks, Autumn. I really love this paper. We have a lot of trust and safety professionals attending, and I really encourage them to go out and read this as soon as they can. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Shelby.
Thanks. So next up, we have Tom Magalinsky, who is a societal computing PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. So Tom, in your paper with Lynette Ng and Kathleen Carley, you develop a framework to surface online coordination. So online coordination, of course, can be used for good, but it can also be used to manipulate information environments, to spread misinformation, or to incite violence. So to start, can you just explain, like, what is your framework? How are you going about identifying coordination?
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. So I guess the first part of this question is how we're defining coordination itself. So it has been defined a number of ways in the literature, and for this work, we're specifically looking at synchronized actions. So when users are taking the same actions online at very similar times, and this is kind of a difficult problem for analysts without the help of some sort of technology, because unlike something like bot detection, where you can look at an account in isolation and based on the features kind of determine whether or not you think it's a bot, coordination and synchronized action is inherently a collective problem. You need to look at multiple accounts to make a determination of whether or not they are kind of coordinating. So when you have a really big data set, you have millions of posts, this is just, it's infeasible to compare all of your users to see if they are taking similar actions at the same time. And even when you zoom in, say you're just interested in, a single hashtag, it is still difficult for an analyst to say, okay, maybe these 2 users are tweeting the hashtag at similar times, but once this group becomes larger, you have 10 people that are coordinating, or they're coordinating using multiple hashtags or using other things like URLs or mentions, it becomes very difficult. So the idea is that with this work, you can first define the kind of dimensions of coordination that you are interested in looking at. So we mostly looked at tweeting hashtags, tweeting URLs, and tweeting mentions. And then from there, we construct a synchronized action network. So instead of looking at all of these different posts and trying to manually kind of compare users, you get this network which shows the strength of connections between 2 different users based on how often they are showing these like synchronized behaviors. And you can have this for multiple dimensions. So you can have a link between 2 users based on how much they're synchronized with hashtags, and with URLs and with mentions. So now we have this thing that we can kind of visually look at and say, oh, this is a cluster where a bunch of users are connected, meaning they're really synchronized. So we know that this is a good place to kind of dive deep into what they're posting about. So then on top of that, we can go a little bit further with some network science-based methods to say, instead of looking at this whole network, we can already show you where these dense clusters in the network are. And within those dense clusters, highlight the most important or the most central users within that. So we can kind of give a really targeted way of, a really targeted thing for analysts to take a deeper dive in to see if actors are coordinating there.
Super neat. Yeah. So you have some really cool empirics in the paper. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you validated your framework?
Yeah. So validation for this kind of work is tricky when you have like we define this like very specific notion of coordination. So you don't have access to nice data sets where you have specifically labeled users that are exhibiting this sort of coordination. So you don't have those sort of data sets that you might have in other tasks. So that's the bad news, but the good news is that it's pretty often that we have kind of what we call public-facing coordination campaigns, where people are very open and deliberate to say that we're going to be taking these actions to basically inflate the discussion about this specific topic that we want people to be thinking about. So what we do is we kind of pull out, well, we first define a number of dimensions of coordination that we want to look at, and then we pull out these example campaigns that are, we can kind of validate our results on. So one example is at the time of our data collection, Greenpeace in Mexico was campaigning for a bill limiting the use of single-use plastics. And they basically said, we want to use these hashtags and we want to mention these politicians. So when we set our system to look at hashtags and mentions, we identify a cluster of users who are all kind of synchronized on these dimensions. And we see that they are, pushing for this Mexico Without Plastics campaign. So we basically did that over a number of different dimensions to pull out a couple of different example public-facing campaigns, things that we can easily say, look, our method is able to pull these out and successfully identify that this is happening. So one, that we know that it kind of works, and two, we have these nice, simple examples to compare with when we dive a bit deeper into more potentially covert coordination, and we see how much more complex it actually is than these nice examples, which kind of follow a template.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. Jeff, passing it to you.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm excited to turn our attention to Rena Feverkorn, who is a research scholar in our very own Stanford Internet Observatory. Rihanna, in your paper on content oblivious trust and safety techniques, you survey content and former employees at services like Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger, and WhatsApp to ask how and when their platforms use metadata to identify online abuse. And this is something in our misinformation work where we see misinformation starting to move into these kinds of channels to be really important work that I appreciate, in particular, how you're able to get access and get responses from these folks. So could you first start us out by telling us what's content dependent and content oblivious techniques in trust and safety? What were you trying to determine about providers' trust and safety practices in your survey? And just give us a high level view of your findings.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so in my paper, I distinguish between content dependent techniques for trust and safety, which, as the name suggests, are tools and techniques that only work if the provider has at-will access to the contents of users' files and communications. And that includes things like having human moderators reviewing content on a service, or having an automated scanning tool that can look for potentially problematic content. And this is distinguished as against content oblivious techniques, which does not depend upon at-will access to content. And that includes not just things like metadata, which you mentioned, metadata analysis, but also other tools such as limits on group size, limits on how many people a message could be forwarded to, for example, or other account actions, as well as user reports, where the provider sees contents of, say, a message or a post, but not because they found it on their own, but because somebody else brought it to their attention. And so that's why I class those as being oblivious rather than dependent on content analysis. The motivation for undertaking this research was that it's been a hot topic in recent years, how to do trust and safety in an increasingly end-to-end encrypted world, where we have enhanced privacy and security measures to protect users, but also at the same time that can potentially, at least partially, impede efforts to do trusted safety or criminal investigations. And the discussions around this debate tend to presume that the only way that trust and safety can happen requires at-will content access. And that presumption is reflected in regulatory proposals around the world, such as to mandate proactive content filtering for all content uploaded to a service, or to weaken or even ban strong encryption. But this focus on content analysis means that content oblivious techniques get overlooked. And so my goal was to learn more about the prevalence and utility of content oblivious techniques that are currently in use by providers, and to raise awareness of them for policymakers and the general public. So to summarize those findings, my analysis includes responses from 13 individuals representing online service providers of various types of services, such as end-to-end encrypted chat apps, user-generated content-driven sites, and so on. And collectively, the providers represented in the sample have billions of users, possibly even the majority of all online users around the world. What I found was that every provider employs both content-oblivious and content-dependent techniques in some combination or other. The most popular one was user reporting, which I found was used by more providers than other techniques such as metadata analysis, automated content scanning, limits on account actions, and so forth. I also asked providers what they consider to be the most useful technique for detecting each of the 12 different categories of abuse that the survey asked about. And there again, I found that user reports predominated. It was considered to be the most useful abuse detection technique for 9 of the 12 categories of abuse in the survey. However, I also found that user reporting tools do not consistently enable reporting of all of those categories of abuse, which seems like an area that could potentially be rectified. The one big outlier here was child sex abuse imagery, where we saw a strong consensus in the data that automated content scanning is what works best for CSAI, but there wasn't any such consensus around the utility of automated scanning for any other abuse type, not even other types of child safety offenses, such as grooming and enticement.
Thanks so much, Rihanna. That's really insightful too. The idea of like the focus on, say AI emphasized content analysis. It makes sense. There's no one way to misinform or to harass or to abuse. And so I think your findings make a lot of sense around the limitations of that approach. What are some of the implications for policymakers, either at the platforms or in state capitals or in DC for some of your findings? As we noted at the top, one of the goals of our journal is to influence policy. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir for a lot of the audience here, but what we see is that abuse is just not a uniform problem that requires a uniform response. Policy debates tend to focus on CSAI as though that is representative of all abuse. But what we see in my data is that CSAI is not like other types of abuse. The techniques that work best against CSAI do not work best for other abuse types, and vice versa. And that means that you cannot accurately forecast the impact of end-to-end encryption in particular based on CSAI alone. I think we tend to see CSAI as the focus for encryption debates about how to regulate that, which is the focus of most of my research. But because end-to-end encryption does not hinder content oblivious techniques, because those don't rely upon access to content, which is the thing that end-to-end encryption get in the way of, that means that we can predict that there will be differing non-uniform impacts from end-to-end encryption on abuse detection efforts. It's going to probably vary depending on what type of abuse we're talking about. And so that means that end-to-end encryption breaking end-to-end encryption or compelling automated scanning or upload filters are proposals that are not necessarily responsive to the what works best and what is most of a problem for doing abuse detection. There's very little reason to break or ban end-to-end encryption if it's not impeding user reports, which are the most useful technique for detecting most types of abuse. And there's very little reason to mandate automated scanning upload filters, since that is not determined to be very useful against most of the categories of abuse that I surveyed. Basically, there's just no silver bullet for online abuse. And without any one-size-fits-all answers here, it's important to preserve the legal flexibility for providers to continue bringing to bear a suite of differing trust and safety tools to respond to different challenges and to be able to evolve their strategies, especially given that abusers themselves are always evolving their strategies.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Fantastic. Thank you, Rihanna. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Rihanna. This is the paper is kind of unlike anything else out there, and we're really appreciative that we could publish it in JOTS. So next we have Cody Bunton, an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, who co-authored a paper entitled Paved with Bad Intentions, QAnon's Save the Children campaign. The paper tackles a campaign in which QAnon conspiracy theorists took and reappropriated a well-known charity slogan, Save the Children, and used it along with images of children for their own purposes. So Cody, could you introduce us to what this QAnon campaign was and tell us about how you went about studying it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity. So in the summer and fall of 2020, social media platforms started to see a suspicious amount of activity around the use of the hashtag Save the Children. Save the Children is a well-known and storied child advocacy charity organization that's been around for about 100 or so years. But a lot of the content around the Save the Children hashtag or Save Our Children hashtag was suspicious and ended up being related to or a vector for exposure to QAnon conspiracy theories. QAnon is based in this idea around a cabal of political elites who are exploiting children, and the Save the Children hashtag sort of provided a way for people to get exposed to these claims about political elites exploiting children in an otherwise innocuous kind of way. So what we wanted to understand was, given that images were a major form of the communication around the Save the Children hashtag QAnon campaign, well, what really was the depiction that the QAnon users were using or the QAnon adherents were using in this campaign? So we collected a large number of images associated with or images that co-occurred with the hashtag Save the Children across a number of social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram in particular. And we wanted to understand what are these depictions of children that co-occur here. So we tried to characterize these children or depictions of children in terms of age, gender, race, and then whether we saw graphic content or how much graphic content was in these images. And what we find is these images show sort of an anchoring in the real world, that there is some parallel between the depictions shown in these images and in the real child trafficking problem, both in the United States and abroad. That in both cases, young girls are primarily the ones who are depicted in the QAnon imagery and are the victims or survivors of child trafficking. But at the same time, the QAnon imagery or imagery associated with the Save the Children hashtag in the QAnon campaign presents a very warped picture of this problem in terms of age and race. So the images are generally of much younger children, whereas the statistics of child trafficking are more split between younger and older adolescents, and massively overrepresent white children in these images. Even in the United States, where white children are slightly more likely to be victims of child trafficking, the depictions in these QAnon images are almost all of white children, despite the fact that children of color are almost as well represented in child trafficking in the United States.
Yeah, so the depictions and kind of visual motifs that these images were using diverged from what we know about real-world child trafficking. And that's one of the big findings of the paper. I guess at a high level, maybe talk us through some of the common tactics you saw that the QAnon campaign was using, and what was your takeaway from all of this?
Absolutely. So the real concern here is that, Save the Children and child trafficking are innocuous and pro-social kinds of movements that most people can get behind, right? Like nobody wants to come out and say, well, no, let's not save the children. So the concern is that you have a social ill that people want to help is being exploited or appropriated as a vector for exposing people to this whole other set or this whole other realm of conspiracy. So the ways that we've seen this kind of thing be appropriated, this appropriation happen, is that there is a real world motif. People are familiar with the visual idea of showing children in need. So there's been commercials about children in need and child suffering for decades now. So if I show you these kinds of images, you very quickly know what this is talking about. You don't have to build a whole new set of messages here to interact with people. They very quickly can see, oh, this is a visual that I can identify with or that I'm familiar with. But then we tweak this by these images can be tweaked by including additional graphic content. So that shows, or it tries to trigger fear, and there's good research that shows these kind of powerful images are very mobilizing from a political perspective. So you get lots of people out by showing not just images of children and children in need, but graphic depictions thereof to get people really motivated to share this content more. Then in addition, by showing not just lots of children who are white in color, despite that's not the real problem, that's not doesn't reflect the problem in the world, we think that this is really an exploitation of fears of white conservative audiences. So we already have seen QAnon is particularly appealing to conservative audiences, and this focus on white children and risks to white children further exploit or further target these white conservative audiences who are already concerned about potentially racial others, even if there's this not obvious aspect of racism there. So we think there's three things at play. One is that we can ground this campaign in a real world familiar visual motif. We can use the imagery and specifically of graphic depictions to really get people angry and upset to share this information. And then by focusing on white children, we get to exploit, or these campaigns can exploit these conservative fears around racial others.
Thanks, Cody. Really appreciate all the authors for coming today. I want to give a special shout out to Michelle and David for helping host the webinar. Thank you, Shelby, Jeff, Alex, for helping putting on this webinar with us. I'm going to plug the website again if you haven't seen it enough in the chat. It's tsjournal.org. All of the papers that you've just heard from are up there and more. And another flag is that we have the upcoming general issue. So submissions for that are due March 31st. You can submit a letter of inquiry by email or through the website. We also have an upcoming special issue and symposium on cryptocurrency and societal harm. The deadline for the special issue is June 15th. And the symposium will be on May 13th. So if you'd like to participate, make sure you get a letter of inquiry in by March 28th. Thanks so much, everyone, for taking an hour out of your day to talk with us, for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.